All right, in class today, we talked about passive versus active transport, but focused a lot on active transport. Remember, active means that the cell is using energy. So it takes energy for this to occur. So if we remember our concentration gradient, in active transport, we are going against the concentration gradient, and we have to use energy to go from low to high concentration. So there's three types of this. There was the sodium-potassium pump, and endocytosis and exocytosis. So sodium-potassium pump is it's actually really complex, but for our purposes, you just need to know it's pumping sodium and potassium across the membrane against the concentration gradient. But let's look at endocytosis real quick. Endocytosis. Endocytosis. I'm going to take large materials into the cell. So let's pretend this is the cell membrane. I'm going to try to draw this in steps. Here's the cell membrane, and I have some particles outside the cell that I need to get into the cell. Okay? What's going to happen is the cell membrane, I'll draw an arrow to go through steps, is going to basically just fold inward. On my notes, it says it buds inward, and these things that were outside the cell start to make their way into this little pouch that was formed, okay? So once they start to get into that little pouch, the farther they get in there, I'll draw another arrow. Once they're all inside there, the cell membrane forms a vesicle, okay? So now that vesicle is formed from the cell membrane. So you probably guessed it. The cell membrane has a vesicle, this is a vesicle, has the same type of membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, that the cell membrane does. So now let me draw the end result here for endocytosis. Basically, I end up with a fully repaired cell membrane, and then I have a vesicle floating around the cell that contains those particles within it. All right? That's endocytosis. Remember, things entering the cell, and this takes energy. Okay? Now, we have a cell in our body, white blood cells, WBCs, I always abbreviate them like that do this. Now, this process in our body specifically is called phagocytosis. Okay? And that is the same thing. Phagocytosis is the same thing as endocytosis, but the difference is white blood cells are gobbling up like bacteria that might try to injure us or make us sick, okay? So that's endocytosis, entering the cell. What about exocytosis? I want to exit the cell. Now it's the exact opposite. Okay, exocytosis. Now I have some molecules in the cell that we need to get out, but they are already in vesicles. Okay, so this vesicle is just going to travel up to the cell membrane. So I'll draw an arrow this way. And it's going to basically kind of become part of the cell membrane, okay? So once it becomes part of the cell membrane, now this is going to, I'll draw another arrow down to here, it's going to open up the cell membrane and do the exact opposite that we saw before. So now these little molecules that I had inside the cell can start to exit the cell. All right? And then finally, we end up with something like this. Now you got the cell membrane completely formed, and I have these molecules that are outside the cell, and they're going wherever we need them to go. In a multicellular organism like us, maybe these cells are making proteins, and these proteins got to get to somewhere else. They're getting them out through exocytosis, okay? So again, this requires energy, and this is exocytosis is exiting, molecules exiting the cell, all right? So that's endocytosis and exocytosis. Now, while I have you on this same video, let me talk about plasmolysis and cytolysis. Plasmolysis first. First of all, plasmolysis and cytolysis are both a result of osmosis, so water going in or out of the cell. okay? So if I have a plant cell, I'll just draw a box because a lot of times plant cells look like boxes. There is a cell membrane inside here, and we want that cell membrane kind of pressed all the way up against the cell wall, all right? And that does that because it has this thing in here called a big central vacuole filled with water. If I surround this cell with, let's say, salt water, or maybe it's a bunch of fertilizer, water is going to start rushing out of the cell. So you're going to see something that looks like this. This cell membrane and vacuole starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? This is called plasmolysis, so this is pretty specific to plants. Okay, you may see it get even smaller, and then if it gets to something that looks like this, our plant is wilted because it has lost a bunch of water through osmosis. Lost water, excuse me, because of osmosis or water rushing out. We put it in a hypertonic environment, okay, because there's a bunch of solutes. So let me color these so be consistent, all right? This will cause the plant to be limp, or possibly wilt, and maybe eventually die because it's lost too much water. This is what happens if you don't water your plants enough, okay? So that's plasmolysis. Now, plant cells want to be surrounded by a hypotonic environment. They constantly want water coming into them to fill that vacuole to make them really strong, okay? But cytolysis, if I just have an animal cell, let's say it's our blood cell, and I place it into a hypotonic environment, okay? And remember, cytolysis is a result of osmosis, so this is a type of passive transport, okay? If it's in a hypotonic environment, I surround it with water, water is gonna rush in and from all directions. If this is not a plant cell, meaning it doesn't have a cell membrane, this thing is gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger, and may eventually end up rupturing, okay? Kind of an odd picture there. Let's draw it rupturing from both sides, okay? If it ruptures because it has too much water rushing into it, that is called cytolysis, okay? We talked about the lady, hold your pee for a wee. This is what happened to her. Her cells filled up with too much water, and her cells burst or died because of cytolysis. Okay, so we have passive transport, which is osmosis, diffusion, and facilitated diffusion. We have active transport, which is the sodium-potassium pump, exocytosis, and endocytosis.